field layout terms. All about establishing a common language and effective communication. So for this exercise, we're going to use a real world piece of land in a faraway place. I used to teach in Lindsay, Ontario at Sir Sanford Fleming College. That's where this here lecture slides first kind of originated from and then been tweaked over the years. But this piece of property that's on Fleming campus called the Smith Field makes an excellent plot for demonstrating field layout terms. So I'll just go into a little bit of brief history of the Smith Field. We're looking at an abandoned plot of land at Sir Sanford Fleming College, donated to the college decades ago and then neglected. It is a long and narrow patch. We're looking at approximately 850 feet by 180 feet, or 260 meters by 55 meters. Roughly a 3.5 acre plot, give or take. That's about all we need to know there. Okay, so we are going to apply our field layout terms to this Smith Field area. Now, our field layout terms are made up of 10 different terms that we're going to go through, and there is a little quiz at the end of this all. Isn't that fun? One of the terms is all about field blocks. One of the terms is all about field blocks. Another term is bed width. Rows per bed we'll be talking about, between row spacing, bed length, in-row spacing, non-growing space, buffer zones, headlands, and access roads. Yesterday, before we got started, I was talking about books, and all of these kind of terms all relate to the Canadian Organic Grower book, which I'm hoping to bring a couple of copies to the farm this afternoon to have available. I'll leave those in the mudroom. So our goal here today is to learn field layout terms. Step 4 of the COG book is all about creating crop maps. And the crop map that we went over this morning during our crop planning check-in is directly related to that step 4 of the Canadian Organic Grower book. And we'll go over those in more detail to teach you how to generate those kind of things during our crop planning lecture into the future. But here for the field layout terms, we're going to roughly follow along with the process of step 4 from the Canadian Organic Grower book. And that way you're going to learn about field layout terms, and you'll receive a small introduction about those crop maps and be able to understand and read that crop map of ours a little bit better. Okay, so as I mentioned, the Smith Field is about 3.5 acres. You're looking at 850 feet by 180 feet. I generally work better in feet than in meters, so I usually talk in feet. So if you were to be following along with that Canadian Organic Grower book, the first step it'll tell you to do is to establish non-growing space around your chosen garden area. So here we are with definition number 1. We're going to talk about non-growing space. And non-growing space is made up of 3 things. We're talking about the buffer zones, we're talking about the headlands, and we're talking about access roads. So this is all the space around the growing space. And that the space around the growing space is going to be made up of buffer zones, headlands, and access roads. All right. So the non-growing space around your active growing space is still needs to be managed, just not as intensively. And you saw that yesterday on farm around field blocks 1 and 2 in particular, where I did some rototillering last fall and established a planting of perennial ryegrass that is managing of the non-growing space. Your buffer zones, which we'll get into a little bit further, they still need to be mowed or planted or trimmed and that kind of stuff. And your headlands need mowing too, and access roads always need maintenance. Okay. Okay, so your non-growing space, as we've been saying, that was our first definition. The non-growing space is the area around your actively growing space. The non-growing space is made up of 3 things. The first one here is going to be the buffer zones. Buffer zones are defined as the areas that separate your crops from neighboring conventionally grown crops. we're assuming they're conventionally grown because that's often the way it is. Now, this here is a surprising fact. The minimum width by federal organic standards of your buffer zone is only 8 meters, which is 26 feet. And if we were in class, I would have a tape measure to show you how close that actually is. That's not very far at all. And people are always surprised by that certified organic regulation that you only need 8 meters, a minimum of 8 meters or 26 feet between you and your conventional neighbors' crops that are being sprayed with insecticides and herbicides and glyphosate and all these kind of good stuff. It's a surprisingly small distance. I usually recommend, and most organic growers usually give a little bit more of a buffer than that. That is just a minimum. And it's also a good idea to establish some sort of vegetation in between that to cut down on any kind of drift. But for now, all you need to, your takeaway here is all about your buffer zones. And your buffer zones are that area that separates your crops from the neighboring crops. So in this in the Smithfield example, there is a high school that is directly beside the Smithfield here. We're in this example, we're going to assume that that high school is a conventional farm, and we're going to set a 30-foot buffer zone, and that's what that yellow line is there. So this here white area is the entire Smithfield, and we just trimmed 30 feet off of one side of it to make a buffer zone. So yeah, what do you guys think about that 26 feet or 8 meters as a buffer zone? Most people are usually pretty surprised by the small amount of distance between crops. Do you guys have any thoughts there?
It's really surprising to me, for sure.
Say that again?
It's really surprising to me. Dealing with the project that I did at the school, I didn't mention this the other day, but I helped with a 40-20 project in the ENR program to convert conventional agricultural field to regenerative agricultural field. And there was a plot nearby that he kind of gave away to allow some Syrian families, some refugee families to grow. And we thought that, that they were going to have to change their practices because he wanted to have a kind of organic market garden, quite nearby. But according to this, it doesn't matter.
Right?
That's really shocking.
Yeah. I think that relates more to the business of organic farming than the spirit of organic farming. And there's often a rub between the two. Once upon a time, when I started out organic farming, there wasn't national standards across Canada. And then that came into effect sometime in the 90s, mid-90s, where there is national standards. And as soon as those national standards were established, it seems as if all of the, especially the larger organic players, were just trying to push as much as possible to make as much money as possible, because I mean that's what they're in the business for. And these kind of regulations seem to get watered down and treated as bare minimums, not as things that could be built on and could be improved on. Just bare minimums that you need to check off in order to keep your certification. And it is surprising to me. And that's why I was saying I usually recommend larger distances between crops than just that. Okay, so we're talking about non-growing space, and within that non-growing space, there were buffer zones. We just talked about that. And then secondly, we have headlands. Headlands refers to the area needed to turn your equipment around at the end of a bed. Now, at the Hayes farm, we're not using very much machinery equipment. We're using more hand tools kind of equipment. But even so, sometimes at the Hayes farm, I get my BCS walk behind tractor going, and we'll introduce you to that soon enough. We'll be on farm to work the field block number 9 there, the tarp area. And so it's still nice to be able to have a bit of area at the end of your rows in order to turn around something like a rototiller or a walk-behind tractor. If you happen to be using a full-on tractor, then what's recommended is a good 8 to 12 meters of room, which sounds like a significant amount of room. However, if you're driving a tractor and you have a piece of equipment on the back of that tractor, such as maybe a set of discs, maybe some harrows, It takes a bit of space to be able to turn around a tractor with an implement on the back of it, and that's why 8 to 12 meters is recommended for your headlands if you're using a tractor. If you're not using a tractor, it's still recommended that you leave 2 to 3 meters for your headlands. In this here example at the Smithfield, we're going to assume we're using a walk-behind tractor or a small rototiller. And on this here map that we have on the side, the first orange line at the top here was your buffer zones for your conventional neighbors. Then the headlands now is made in these thicker yellow lines, and that is further trimming our field by 2 to 3 meters. I mean, obviously this map's not to scale, but it's further trimming our fields by 2 to 3 meters on either side to make up your headlands. Your headlands would need to be relatively obstruction free in order to turn around equipment, whether that equipment happens to be a tractor, a rototiller, or just you on foot. You still need your headlands to be relatively obstruction free. And it's a good practice to keep that area mowed and tidy to create more airflow and reduce your insect pressure. Okay, so also in your non-growing space, you're also looking at things like access roads. That's your third component of your non-growing space. Access roads usually run parallel and perpendicular to your beds, and they provide access to your field beds, or to your field blocks. So if you remember the Smith Field here, we're looking at is approximately 850 feet long. Which is, relatively long, narrow kind of block. The access roads help break that up. Here is a very good point down at the bottom. The Canadian Organic Grower book recommends that at any spot in your field block, no matter where you're at in that field block, you shouldn't have to travel more than 100 feet to reach an access road. So if you're in the middle of this here, the field block over to the immediate left here, let me see if I can get a pointer happening. Yeah, if you're in the middle of this here field block, it shouldn't take you any more than 100 feet to reach an access road, whether that access road is there or down here at your headlands or over at the side. Because if you're harvesting, say, and you're in the middle of that block with a 50-pound crate of cucumbers, you don't want to travel that far with it. You want to be able to get it over to your access road real quick, where you have either a wheelbarrow or some sort of something on wheels in order to help you carry that thing out. So your access roads help break up your garden space in order to provide access to your field blocks. So that is the third element of your non-growing space. You got your buffer zones, you got your headlands, and then you have your access roads. Now your access roads are typically one-way roads without any turnaround spots. And the width of your access road will depend on the type of operation you're running. If you're running an operation with a tractor, it's going to have to be wide enough to manage that tractor. If you're running an operation with just a rototiller or BCS tractor, you can be a little bit narrower on your access roads. And it's great to be able to manage your access roads with, like, I don't like to have too much bare soil on the farm. So it's nice to be able to manage your access roads with something low growing, like a white clover is super nice. Or even just managing it in grass, the grasses and natural weeds that come up there, and keeping that mowed and not going to seed is a good thing to do too. I like to have vegetation everywhere on the farm to hold down the soil. Okay, so there is, so our plot now, so we took a very long rectangular plot. We put in our buffer zone here next to our conventional neighbor is what we're assuming. We put in our headland, so we have access to turn around our rototiller or just ourselves on the ends of the beds. And then we created access roads in between in order to make sure that you're not traveling any more than 100 feet from your middle of your plot to the access road. So after trimming, you actually lose quite a bit of your field plot, but it's necessary. I'm not sure if this math is quite right, but after trimming our 3.5 acre plot, we're going to end up with more of we might lose an entire acre to this trimming. But it's necessary. That's a necessary loss in order to keep this growing area more active. Okay, so that is our first four definitions. We had the non-growing space, we had the headlands, we had the access roads, and then we had the buffer space. Well, maybe I should pause for a second. Any questions with the first four definitions? Good, good, moving on. The next definition, number 5, that we're going to deal with is the field blocks. So a field block is the basic unit in a field layout. Now, when you're designing field blocks, you want to make sure that all field blocks have an equal growing space, whether you're dealing with square meters or square feet. You want to make sure that they're all kind of relatively equal in growing space. It is super nice if they have the same number of beds of identical length. And in our example here for the Smith field, because we have a long rectangular narrow plot, that is easy to do. Now, in a cramped space, such as Hayes Farm, as you saw in our farm walkabout yesterday, some beds are 100 feet long. Like in field block 1 and 2. Field block 3 has some beds that are 150 feet long. Field blocks 5 and 6 have beds that are 50 feet long. But by the time you're doing all the math on it, the size of each of those field blocks are relatively similar. Even though that the length of beds might be different in each, but the overall square footage or square meters of each space is relatively similar. Now, the reason that becomes important is because it's nice to be able to flip around your field blocks. Things that you grew in field block 1 can get switched over to field block 2, and field block 2 to field block 3 in order to get a nice crop rotation happening. But the actual dimensions of whatever your field blocks are is going to depend on the scale and scope of your operation and the physical boundaries of your field. Here with the Smith field being a nice long rectangular field, it divides up super nice and easy. And as soon as we put in those access roads to make sure that we're not walking too far with our harvests or whatever we're walking with, it automatically divided all this up into some nice even field blocks. We got what, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 field blocks here on the Smith field. So definition number 5, field blocks. You're talking about the basic unit in a field layout. You want them to be as close to in square footage as possible. Whether you're talking, you know, at 100 by 100 or 500 by 20, you're looking for that identical square footage. The open rectangular field is super easy. Hayes Farm is a little bit trickier. So as I was saying, as soon as we added in our access roads on that step, our field blocks kind of just, on the Smith field anyway, our field blocks just kind of almost made themselves. The dimensions of these field blocks are 145 feet long, that going this a ways, and then 105 feet, oh wait a minute, 145 feet long going this a ways, and then 105 feet wide going east to west. Now, I mentioned this yesterday on our farm walk, at least to one group. I'm not sure how many groups I mentioned this to, but it's usually better to grow your crops north-south than east-west. Usually, but not always. Now, does anybody have any idea of why it's better to grow your crops north-south as opposed to east-west?
Because when it's north-south, you're going to get constant sunshine. Like it's going to be the same during the whole period that it gets it. East to west, it's going to change.
Right. The morning sun is different than the afternoon sun. If you have your crops laid out east-west, and Jared, you nailed it. That was perfect. If you have your crops growing east to west, say if you have, I don't know, tomatoes growing in the field laid out east to west. The tomatoes that are on the east are going to get the morning sun, whereas the tomatoes on the west are going to get the afternoon sun. The afternoon sun tends to be hotter because the day, you know, it heats up as it goes on. So the tomatoes on the west will most likely be more abundant and yield more than the tomatoes on the east. That's why it's better to lay your rows out north and south. That being said, sometimes just given the dimensions of your garden space, you need to lay out your beds east-west, and you just have to roll with it and be accepting some sort of variance in your crop. But if you have a choice, I always like to be able to lay out the beds north to south. So as I was mentioning, the field blocks on Hayes Farm are not as neat and tidy, but they're still effective. This here is an old map of our old field block layout system. This morning we saw the new map, so I'm going to skip over this one here real quick because that's not so relevant anymore. Okay, so once you have your field blocks made, such as our example here in Smithfield, where we got our 7 different field blocks, then you can start making decisions about how to group your crops into the field blocks. That's why field blocks become so important. You can put all of your early crops in one field block if you wanted to. You can put it so that in this far field block, all of the crops mature at the exact same time. You might be growing 4 different crops in that field block, but you have it planned so that they all mature at the exact same time so that you can harvest it all at the exact same time and then cover crop that area later. So that's another strategy for managing your field blocks. I was also mentioning about crop rotation. If you have 7 identical field blocks, such as this here map has, you can make one field block your allium family. That's all of your onions. You can make another field block your entire squash block. You can make another field block your entire nightshade block with tomatoes and peppers and eggplant. And then year to year, you just end up flipping these blocks and rotating them. And that's why field blocks are so important to establish on a farm. Now, at the Hayes Farm, because we are a teaching farm, we have tried to arrange our field blocks to have a little bit of every crop so that you guys can see a little bit of every crop grow. On a working farm, that's a bit of a nightmare. On a working farm, it's better to arrange your field blocks like I just been mentioning about assigning crop families or similar planting dates or similar harvesting dates or whatnot. On a working farm, you wouldn't have the kind of crop layout that we have in our gardens, but that's okay. Cause we have more of a demonstration kind of thing, trying to get you guys familiar with each and every crop. Another consideration is you can group crops based on light feeders versus heavy feeders. Your light feeders would be things like, I don't know, maybe radish, lettuce might be in there as a light feeder, and you can put that into one field block. And then you can put all your heavy feeders into another field block. This is your squash and your tomatoes and things that take up a lot of nutrients out of the ground. And that way that block can be managed to be more fertility, more fertilizer inputs into that block. Whereas your light feeders doesn't need it as much. And that therefore you're managing your field blocks according to labor. Another good idea too, in a map such as this, and this could work at Hayes Farm too, is to deliberately establish one of these field blocks as a cover crop or a fallow block yearly. And so say if that was this one here in the middle, and we decided that in 2020, we're gonna cover crop this all with clover, which is fantastic. Clover is a nitrogen fixer. When you plow it into your soil, it'll add a ton of organic matter to your soil. It'll increase your fertility. It will keep down your weed pressure because the clover forms a nice mat and will outperform weeds. So you're doing all sorts of good stuff for your soil by having a fallow field block for a season. And then the next season, that fallow field block can rotate and then rotate and then rotate for then you have a 7-year garden rotation. And if you had a block of heavy feeders, that is the nice one to follow that clover. So if you had clover in here this year, you might want to have your heavy feeder block right next to it. And then the following year, this clover field moves that way. And then your heavy feeder follows that clover field because that field is nice and well looked after. So that's the importance of, that's one of the advantages of creating field blocks. They're an extremely useful planning and farm management tool. Okay, next definition is all about bed widths. So when we talk about the bed width, a bed width is measured from the center of one pathway to the center of the next pathway. A lot of people, when they talk about bed width, are only looking at their particular bed, but that's wrong. You don't want to be looking at just the one bed. You want to be looking at middle of pathway to the middle of the pathway, and that is what will be called your bed width. Now, how wide that you want to establish your beds depends on your style of farming. If you are farming with a tractor, you want to establish your beds so that the wheel width of your tractor, which is called the wheel base of your tractor, matches the beds of your farm, or the beds of your field block, I should say. That way you can drive that tractor right down that garden and the wheels stay in the pathways and you're straddling the bed. In my previous operation in Ontario, I used to operate a 1945 Farmall tractor, and it was a scuffling tractor. And you're able to drive that tractor over top of the bed, and basically it has attachments on it that kind of act as small hose, and you're just straddling that bed. You're trying to straddle your crop, and you're trying to use those hose, drag them over the bed to do all your weeding for you mechanically. And so that is the reason that you want to be able to match your bed width to your tractor wheelbase in order to be able to drive your tractor over and do some mechanical weeding. Now, at the Hayes Farm, we are not farming with a tractor. I like to present both to you, though, just in case somebody wanted to go down that road and do some farming with a tractor, because this is just some strategies here. The Hayes Farm, we're not using a tractor, though, so it's not as important to match that wheelbase of the tractor. So this here is a recommendation from the Canadian Organic Grower Book. That if you are not using a tractor, generally 48 inches to 60 inches is your typical bed width for your beds. Now, at the Hayes Farm, field blocks 1 and 2 and field blocks 5 and 6 were all made in the fall of 2017, before I started at the farm, and they were made a little bit narrower. They're closer to maybe 40 inches, 48 inches, something like that. When I'm making new beds, especially in field blocks 7 and 8, those are all new beds in the last year or two, and I've been making those a little bit wider. I prefer a little bit wider of beds myself. I just find them nicer to work in, just not as cramped, not as packed. Okay, definition number 6 is all about bed width. Bed width is measured from the center of one pathway to the center of the next pathway. So if you have a narrower bed of 48 inches, that might look like 9 inches worth of pathway, 30 inches worth of bed, and another 9 inches of pathway, which if you combine those 2 9 inches, you end up with a pathway that's 1.5 feet wide and beds that are 2.5 feet wide. Another strategy, if you're using the 60 inches beds, which is 5 feet wide beds, you could put 12 inches of pathway, that's half of that pathway, and then a 36-inch bed plus another 12 inches of the pathway, resulting in 2-foot pathways and 3-foot beds. That's kind of something I like a little bit more myself, that kind of spacing. If you're using a tractor with a nice wide wheelbase, you might want to go with something even wider with a 2.5-foot pathway and a 3.5-foot bed. But if and when you're designing this for your own home kind of gardens, those are things to keep in mind. So if we apply this to the Smithfield, we have 7 blocks currently in the Smithfield after we divided it with the access roads. Each of our field blocks are 105 feet wide. And if we used a 60-inch bed width, which would be that 5 feet from here to here, we end up with 21 beds per field block. So we'll end up with 21 5-foot wide beds. And if you do the math on that, that gives us 105 feet, which matches our field blocks nicely. So on the Smithfield, we can put in 21 beds per every one of those 7 field blocks. So at the Hayes Farm, some of our beds, as I was mentioning, have a 4-foot bed width, and some of our beds, ignore those blocks, those have been changed and updated, but some of our beds have a 5-foot bed width. I prefer the 5-foot bed width myself, as I was mentioning. Okay, now that was bed width. Now we're moving on to bed length. Bed length refers to the length of your beds, and how long your beds are going to be will be determined by your site and your farming practices. Now, if you're farming with a tractor, you want your beds to be a minimum of 300 feet long. This is a recommendation by the Canadian Organic Grower book there again, and I completely agree with it. And if you're not using a tractor, 100-foot beds are common, but it's really kind of up to you how you want to arrange that. Now with the tractor, the reason the 300-foot beds are recommended is because you end up wasting too much time turning around. If your beds are only like 50 feet or 100 feet long with a tractor, you're just doing a 50-foot or 100-foot pass, then you're going to have to turn around and then come back around and then do that. And based on how narrow these beds are, turning around looks like you going to the end, making a turn, putting it in reverse, and then coming back around in order to make a nice tight turn to get to the next bed. And it just takes a lot of time. It doesn't, like, on the surface, it's just like, oh, you know, it doesn't seem like that much. But after you're done doing 21 beds in one field block, and then you still have 6 more field blocks to do with 21 beds, it takes up a considerable amount of time, which is why your tractor beds should be longer. If you're not using a tractor, then you can get away with whatever makes sense to you. My previous operation at Grassroot Organics, I had some beds that were as much as 450 feet long. And for me to be out there in the field, I had no problem managing a 450-foot long, whether I was on a tractor or not on a tractor. However, sometimes, especially with new workers, if you send them out to a 450-foot long bed with a hoe, it can be very intimidating to look at. It doesn't bother me so much. You just kind of keep your head down and just work at the exact space that you're at without worrying about the whole rest of that bed. But I've seen some people just kind of shut down looking at a 450-foot long bed and being very intimidated by it, as I'm sure you can imagine. Oh, technical difficulties. Hang on. Okay. So on the Smithfield example, the bed length is kind of decided for us. The bed length was just as long as our access roads are. We ended up with 21 5-foot long beds, and each are 145 feet long, and that's the way that is. Now the bed length at the Hayes farm, 100 foot is kind of the target. It's a nice, comfortable spot to work at. And field blocks 1 and 2 are exactly that, at 100 feet long. But we have irregularly shaped field blocks, such as field block 3, that's 150 feet long. And as I was saying, as you get comfortable at Hayes Farm, and whether you're working on a bed that's sometimes 20 feet long or a bed that's 150 feet long, you'll see how that affects your mental attitude going in towards the bed. That's another reason too that I like to break down those beds into multiple plantings, such as we saw on the field operation calendar, where you're not prepping, usually you're not prepping an entire bed at once. Usually you're prepping just 15 feet or 20 feet of it at a time. Just helps you out mentally. Okay, next definition number 8, we're going to talk about rows per bed. So each bed has the ability to have up to 3 rows in that bed. It doesn't necessarily mean that we will be planting all 3 rows in that bed, but it does mean that each bed has the ability of having up to 3 rows per bed. That gives you the option of either planting all 3 rows, such as for a crop of, say, baby cut salad greens or cut arugula or radish perhaps, or maybe salad turnips. You can plant all 3 rows. Or you have the option of planting just the 2 outer rows in order to allow for larger plants. And that is very suitable for something like, say, beans, maybe beets, carrots is another one that's very suitable for planting 2 outer rows. Or you have the option of planting 1 middle row for plants that get very big and robust, such as tomatoes, squash, cucumbers, things that trail and vine and that kind of stuff. So it's up to the grower to kind of decide if you're going to be planting 1 row, 2 rows, or 3 rows for every bed. But every bed is capable of having up to 3 rows. Now, when I was mentioning about my 1945 Farmall scuffling tractor, and I was mentioning that I had attachments on it that pretty much kind of act as hose, When I am straddling a bed with that scuffling tractor, I can then arrange those hose based on what crop I have in that bed. If I'm only planting the middle of that bed, I can arrange my hose to be here and here in order to do the mechanical weeding in between whatever crop I have here. Or I can change up those hose to be here and here and here and here, so I can straddle row number 1 and 3 and scuffle everything in between. Or I can change up my hose again on the underneath of my tractor and have a hoe here on the outside of row 1, and then on the inside of row 1, and then on the middle, and then on the outside, in order to weed all 3 rows at the same time. So that's it's super handy to have nice straight rows on your beds. Now, this is the time that Cecilia kind of makes fun of me a little bit in a nice, gentle way. Cecilia is not about very nice straight rows on the farm. She likes more of the traditional mound style plantings. I got nothing wrong against that anyway myself. I like traditional mound plantings too. The reason most farms are laid out in nice, simple rows is to accommodate equipment. Whether that equipment happens to be a tractor, or whether that equipment happens to be a wheel hoe, or whether that equipment happens to be a hand hoe. If you have nice, straight, even rows, you're able to run a piece of equipment down it really fast and easy, if that's what you're after. And not every garden is designed to have that maximum yield and maximum efficiency. However, if you are a working garden, that certainly does help. It certainly helps you pay the bills. If you have a garden at home that you want to manage in a more therapeutic manner, maybe you have, maybe you don't have rows at all. Maybe it's all in spirals. You can do all sorts of different stuff. The row method and the bed method is just for maximizing your yield and maximizing, let's face it, the dirty word, the profit. And we'll talk more about economics and farm economics and that kind of stuff. But that's what these rows and beds kind of gear towards, is that maximum kind of output for the grower. Okay, so definition number 8 was all about rows per bed. Rows per bed is the number of rows planned for each bed. Every row is capable of having every bed is capable of having up to 3 rows, whether or not you choose to plant it accordingly with just 1 row or 2 rows or all 3. But we always plan to have 3 rows per bed. Okay, moving on to definition number 9. 9 is between row spacing, and that's exactly what it sounds like. This here is the space between the rows of crops on a single bed. Now, I threw out some examples of how to arrange your bed width and your pathways versus your beds on a 48-inch bed width and on a 60-inch bed width. Here is another example using 60-inch bed width. If you choose to use a 60-inch bed width, you're looking at 12 inches of space from the middle of the pathway to the edge of the bed. Then you're looking at another 6 inches from the edge of the bed to row number 1. Then you're looking at about 12 inches of spacing to get to row number 2, and you're looking at another 12 inches spacing to get to row number 3, and then another 6 inch on the side of the bed, and then another 12 inches on the pathway. So your between row spacing ends up becoming 12 inches in between rows, and that is your between row spacing. Oh, wait a minute, that was an example. That is a typo. This is probably an example with what, a 48-inch? Oh no, wait a minute. So if you want to make a 60-inch bed with 2-foot pathways, here's an example of how you can lay out your between row spacing. If you had a 60-inch bed with smaller pathways of only 16-inch pathways, you can make your beds a little bit wider and your pathways a little bit smaller. And instead of having just 14 inches between rows, you can go up to instead of having just 12 inches between rows, you can go up to 14 inches between rows. But that's up to you as the grower to decide on your between row spacing. As I mentioned at the Hayes farm, we always plan for 3 rows per bed. But some of our beds are a little bit narrower than others, and sometimes you got to be a little bit flexible to kind of roll with the punches and ask your field block mentor. So sometimes you might be planning to have 3 rows in a bed, but that bed might be a little bit narrow due to a variety of circumstances, and maybe you and your field block mentor decide, you know, maybe 2 rows is more appropriate in this bed. Okay, and our last definition here is the in-row spacing. So previous we were talking about between rows, and here we're talking about in-row spacing. So in-row spacing is measured from the middle of plant A to the middle of plant B. Just like our bed width was measured from the middle of the pathway to the middle of the pathway, this is measured from the middle of plant A to the middle of plant B. So here we have a picture of lettuces. We have lettuces being planted in 4 rows on a bed, which we don't do. This here is just something I grabbed off the internet for demonstration purposes, but we typically will go with rows of either 2 or 3 for lettuce plantings, not rows of 4. But that said, we're talking about in-row spacing, and this is a good picture to demonstrate in-row spacing. So you're looking at the center of lettuce 1 and to the center of lettuce 2, and typically for lettuce, you're looking at a 12-inch spacing. So that is your in-row spacing. And depending on how you are planning to weed your beds will determine how far apart you want to plant your plants. The Canadian Organic Grower Book has appendixes at the back with all sorts of charts that have recommended minimum planting distances for plants. They are very useful. We will be referring to those as the season goes on. But anytime we talk about in-row spacing, what you need to know is that's the middle of plant A to the middle of plant B. And besides the Canadian Organic Grower Book with that reference for in-row spacing, almost every seed package comes with spacing recommendations. They will tell you how far to plant plants in row spacing and between row spacing on almost every seed package. And beyond that, seed companies such as Johnny Selected Seeds, they have a great online catalog for reference too. It reads like a plant encyclopedia. Almost all the information you want to know about plant spacing or between row spacing is all on that Johnny's website for every one of their crops, which is amazing. Okay, so now we are going to recap, and then we are going to have a short little quiz. So we had 10 definitions we went over. We talked about non-growing space. That non-growing space was made up of access roads, headlands, and buffer zones. We talked about bed width. We talked about bed length. We talked about rows per bed, between row spacing, and in-row spacing. All the definitions are there. Non-growing space, buffer zones, headlands, access roads, field blocks. We'll go over, we won't spend much time more on that. We talk about bed width, talk about bed length, rows per bed, between row spacing, in row spacing. All right. So we are about to enter the quiz portion. Quiz is very lax. Nobody's actually keeping count. So, you know, what you do need though is maybe just a pen and paper, something to jot things down, and maybe you can just use your computer that you have open. I'm about to throw out a bunch of questions. We're going to go through all kind of 10 definitions of questions, and then we'll review to make sure everybody's on the same page. First we have some additional things to make note of. That minimum, that minimum width for federal organic standards is only 26 feet. Nice to be able to have some room to turn around at the end of your rows. Access roads should allow, you shouldn't have to travel any more than 100 feet to reach an access road. Field block should have equal growing space. It's great to have the same number of beds, but not completely necessary. Great to have identical length, but not completely necessary. We talked about growing crops north to south as opposed to east to west. Talked about field blocks being a very useful planning tool. standard bed widths for tractors, standard bed widths for non-protractors, standard bed lengths for tractors, standard bed lengths not for tractors, 3 rows per bed we talked about, and in-row spacing determined by weeding equipment and plant spacing requirements. Okay, so a little bit of recap. So your first question on this quiz here is to define in-row spacing. So please jot something down there, and we'll revisit that in just a second. Question number 2, define the terms rows per bed, and jot down something, bullet point about why rows per bed is a useful management tool. Next question is about between row spacing. Define the term between row spacing. Next term is access roads. Next term is buffer zones. Then we're looking at bed width. Next is headlands.
Oh, shit, sorry.
Next is field blocks. Next is non-growing space. Then we're looking at bed length. And a bonus cue, minimum buffer zone distance. And your access roads should allow access to any spot in the field block without having to travel more than Oh, and the last question here is for nice, even, uniform crop growth, you should plan your rows north-south or east-west. Okay, so the whole point of this quiz, I mean, the quiz doesn't really count for anything. It's just to see how much you retained and seeing what you might need to kind of go over again if you didn't get it the first time. So we're going to go over the answers here next. So in row spacing, your answer hopefully is something along the lines of the space between the crops in a single row. Rows per bed are the number of rows planned for each bed. For easiest management, most growers establish 3 rows for every bed. And how is this useful? Because it leaves the option to plant all 3 rows, or just plant the 2 outer rows, or just plant the 1 middle row. Between row spacing is the space between rows of crops on a single bed. Access roads that run parallel and perpendicular to your beds, and they provide access to your field blocks. Buffer zones are the areas that separate your crops from neighboring conventionally grown crops. Bed width measured from center of one pathway to the center of the next pathway. Headlands are the area needed to turn your equipment around at the end of the bed. Field block is your basic unit in a field layout. Non-growing space is made up of buffer zones, headlands, and access roads. And it is the space around the growing space. Bed length refers to the length of your beds, and that's often determined by the site itself and your farming practices. Tractor versus non-tractor usually. And then our bonus questions, that minimum width by federal organic standards, you're looking at 8 meters or 26 feet. Access roads is that magic number is 30 meters or 100 feet is what you're looking to have access to your access roads from. For nice, even, uniform crop growth, you want to grow your crops north-south. And I think that's that. Boom. That concludes our field layout lecture. Feeling good? All on the same page? Okay. So from this point on, when you're in your field blocks, never refer to your beds as rows. That is something that often comes up throughout the season, and people like to use those terms interchangeably, beds and rows. But in order to communicate effectively, your beds are made up of 3 rows, and your rows are just one of 3 rows per bed. Does that make sense? Okay. Does anybody have any questions dealing with those field layout terms before we start talking about some practical growing skills?
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm kind of confused about the difference between row spacing and in-row spacing.
Anybody can handle that one?
So like in-row spacing is within the row. Say you got carrots in a row, and you're gonna make sure each carrot has enough space to grow within that row. Row spacing is making sure that each row of carrots has enough space between each other. So one's X, Y, like a graph like that. And so you're going along the X, that's the in-row spacing. Along the Y is row spacing, I think.
I'm following you. That makes sense to me. Does that make sense to you, Tabby?
Yeah, that makes more sense, yeah.
Great. Any other questions?
I'm just curious, do you know how they came up with the 8-meter buffer zone? Like, is there a reason?
Yep. It's certainly been debated and scienced out. My last farm I was operating at in Ontario, it was a 100-acre farm. Me and my wife Laura were managing 10 acres of that 100-acre farm. Right next to us was a conventional cabbage grower. That was our neighbor. Our neighbor claims to control the flow of cabbage across North America. That's how much cabbage he grows. It's an endless amount of cabbage. You can stand in his cabbage field, and in every direction, all you see is cabbage. And it was all grown conventionally. He used to get out there and spray. Most every Wednesday was his spray day. To get back to your question here, so the minimum organic standard is that 8 meters. That minimum organic standard, they're assuming that your conventional neighbor is being responsible. They're assuming that they're following, in order to be spraying pesticides, herbicides, or whatnot, you got to take a course, you got to get licensed for it. During that course and that licensing, which I've never taken and I've never went down that road, but during that course, they tell you that you shouldn't be spraying your chemis on a windy day because then you end up with drift. And usually that's in that conventional farmer's best interest to not spray on a windy day, because then when you spray, you're spraying money, right? Like, you have to buy these chemicals. It's costing you labor to be in that tractor, or you're hiring out labor to be in that tractor. And the responsible thing to do is to spray when the conditions are best. And if they were spraying when the conditions are best, 8 meters is fine. However, schedules being schedules, my conventional neighbor farmer liked to spray on Wednesdays. It matched his schedule well. And I can tell you, there are some Wednesdays he was out there where I was like, no, he shouldn't be out there. But he still was, because that matched his schedule well, because that's a human thing to do, you know? He's busy on these other days. Wednesday fits his schedule well, and that's the day he's going to spray. The 8 meters was established as a federal organic standard based on good practices. However, I can tell you, in reality, not everybody has good practices. And that's why I recommend more of a buffer if you're going in that direction. And that's exactly what we did on our farm. We doubled that buffer, and we established poplar trees in between us too. Any other questions?
Not really a question, but worth discussing is that New Brunswick, the management of the NB power lines, especially the soil around there, needs a bit of an extra buffer. So if you want to be urban farming, you have to be conscientious of like some of the other stuff going on, like not even just conventional farmers, but like other things surrounding you and drift soil quality and stuff like that. I remember we were working with asphalt and stuff, so we actually had to do like total removal of like parking lot to try and introduce like soil to what was like essentially just a mix of chemicals and stuff like that. It comes back with seasons.
Oh, I missed that very last part. The guy, would you say?
So like not even just about placement, it's like water runoff and irrigation too can
Sure.
go through your buffer zones, like
Yep.
so you have to do soil assessments throughout the seasons
Yep.
to see exactly what's coming into your field, because we thought we had a good thing going, but after spring really ran all the chemicals down from the lines, everything went eaten.
And that's an excellent point in general. No individual farm exists in a bubble, right? You always have to look at what happens around your farm. And you brought up a very good point about hydro lines is one, and especially in an urban farming kind of setup. Once upon a time, I was doing some volunteer work back when I was in college, establishing a garden at in a nursing home. It was a nursing home for Alzheimer's patients. And so I was establishing a garden there, and it was going well. Except our neighbors was the city, it was parkland, and they go along and spray. And there was this nice chain link fence that I was growing peas and flowering sweet peas up, and they were coming along nicely. Except when the city came along, yeah, forget about it. What are all these things growing on this fence? Let's get rid of them. And so yeah, you really have to watch out for your neighbors and that kind of stuff. And so buffer zones become important.
With other places like in Oneida territory with the Iroquois, it's actually it's the worst, because basically in Ontario around the lake, it would be good growing all year, and then because the policies around dumping effluent means you can only dump so much in a while, a glue company would dump it all in one day, and so you'd have this great season and then just fucking gone for plastic tape.
Oh man, what a heartbreak. That's terrible. Another good point too to bring up is living rurally back in Ontario. We would get notices every now and again of the city or the municipality coming by and spraying ditches. And if your garden was anywhere close to that ditch, again, you're talking about having to establish a buffer zone there, or getting a hold of that municipality ahead of time and telling them to skip your area because you're going to mow it or whatnot, and they'll hold you to it too at that. So that's another thing, another consideration. Any other questions dealing with field layouts before we move on?
Can we get the definitions like on the drive?
Yes, I will share all of that. I'll share that entire slideshow with you my first opportunity.
Okay.
Make a little note there. Anybody else have anything else? Okay. Next topic I'd like to move on to is practical growing skills. Now we only got about 20 minutes left here in this little time slot. I am thinking some of our talk here about practical growing skills might spill over to next Monday afternoon. Next Monday, which is May 4th, is one of those rare days that we are scheduled to be in class in the morning and in class in the afternoon. The afternoon portion, as I was mentioning yesterday during the orientation, will be a little bit lighter. So I might tack on some of this practical growing skills to that Monday afternoon, but we should definitely jump in here and try to get started anyway. And in order to get started, 1 second here, just popping up some notes. In order to get started, what I'd like to do is just give a go around here, and I would like to have everybody mention one thing, or maybe more than one thing if you got more than one, about what you think are the bare minimal skills needed for gardening, for market gardening. Now, I don't want to lead you on too much, but I'm trying to think of examples here just to kind of get you guys started. One example that I'm going to throw out there, I wonder, I'm reluctant to even, I'm thinking here. No, I'm going to leave it wide open for now. I want you guys to brainstorm just something. Just everybody come up with something that you can throw out there, and I'm going to take it from the top here, and I'm going to pick on you one at a time here. And I want everybody to think of one thing that you think is an excellent skill to have on a market garden farming operation. And just because you're at, oh, I think it's, oh, no, it's not. Just because you're at the top of my list, I'm going to pick on Eldia here to start with and put you on the spot. And Alexa, you're next. You're on deck. So Eldia, I'd like you to throw out one thing that you think is a very good skill to have on a market gardening farm.
Irrigation?
Fantastic. Then we had Alexa. Alexa's up now. Hannah's up next.
I don't know, weed control?
Fantastic. Hannah, you're up now. Jared, you're next.
I was gonna say, like, knowing when too much water is too much and when is not enough.
Okay, water management. Who did I say was next?
Me.
Jared.
Good. Can you hear me?
Yep.
All right, patience, because any of these things, other stuff's going to come in your way. Hot days, cold days, stormy days, you don't control it. So you got to be patient and you got to be persistent.
Love it. Hannah. Sierra, you're next.
Pest control.
Sierra, you just jumped right in there. Nice work. Pest control. Hannah, you're up.
Me again, or
Oh, sorry. Yeah, you already went. Sorry, the order of my list here keeps changing. I'm sorry. Lewis.
Well, I will say organization.
Organization. Love it. Matthew.
Time management.
Time management. That goes well with organization. Love it. Tabby.
Using the right tools.
Right tools for the right job. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Who am I missing? Oh, I'm missing Eugene and Chris. That's who I'm missing. And Chris is definitely not with us. Eugene, I'm not quite sure what's going on. Okay, so fantastic list so far. We got irrigation, we got weed control, we got water management, we got patience, pest control, organization, time management, and the right tools for the right job. And that's a fantastic list. And I agree with all of those things. What I want to put forward as probably my single most bare minimum skill on a farm, regardless of what kind of farming operation you're doing. I mean, obviously at the Hayes farm, we got a market garden farm happening, but whether you had a livestock farm, whether you're growing grain and cereal crops, no matter what you're doing, I think the best skill you can possibly have on a farm is problem solving. I find half of farming, more than half of farming, the majority of farming is all about problem solving. And I kind of dig that. I kind of really like that about farming is there's always, no matter how long you've been in it for, there's always a new problem to be solved. And a little bit of research goes a long way. A little bit of patience, which is on our list here already, goes a long way with that too. Just being able to critically think your way through a situation and being able to problem solve it. And often that means kind of doing the best you can with what you have on hand at the time. Farming is a very tight margin kind of business, and you can't always be running out to buy something to solve a problem. So often you're looking at kind of doing the best you can with what you got. It's definitely best to be proactive about it, and try to anticipate problems. But no matter what you do, no matter what happens, weather being the weather and insects being insects, you're going to be dealing with new problems all the time. And a prime example of this is the leek moth, which falls under our pest control here that was mentioned as a skill as well. Who has heard of the garlic leek moth?
I've seen it. I've heard of it. I am not a fan.
Yeah, you and me both. Anybody else have any experience with the garlic leek moth? So last year at Hayes Farm was the very first year. I've been growing garlic for, I don't know, maybe 20 years. Last year was the very first year we applied row cover to our garlic in order to keep that garlic leek moth off. And we had a fantastic garlic crop. Last year, we grew maybe 100-foot bed of garlic, no, maybe more, maybe 150-foot bed of garlic. And that was all under row cover. And then right beside it, we had a trial patch of about 10 feet of garlic with no row cover, just to see the difference between the garlic leek moth. And the patch that was uncovered certainly got eaten by the leek moth. I wouldn't say devastated, but there was definitely some damage there, whereas the crop that was under the row cover did so much better. Now the garlic leek moth, I bring this up because it's a new pest. It's a relatively new pest to Atlantic Canada. It's a relatively new pest to Canada in general. I believe it came up into Ontario first, kind of climate change, global warming kind of issues, and it made its way north into Ontario first, and now it's spreading across the southern border of Canada. And this past winter, I went to a farmers meeting in Trealout, down in Nova Scotia, and I attended a talk on the garlic leek moth. And this year, I'm kind of getting ahead of myself this year, kind of getting into our integrated pest management lecture, which we'll talk more about the garlic leek moth then. But the thing I'm kind of getting at now is that problem solving is, when I was first growing garlic 20 years ago, and for maybe the first 15 years I was growing garlic leek moth wasn't a thing. Didn't have to worry about it. Then all of a sudden one day you notice, oh, something's eating my garlic, and then you're into the problem solving mode, and you're trying to figure out what this problem is. But anyway, we'll talk more about how to control that garlic leek moth in our integrated pest management. I just kind of wanted to throw that in there as an example of problem solving, things that always come up. No matter how proactive you are, all of a sudden in a season, you might just get a new pest that you've never had to deal with before. And that's all about that thinking and problem solving. So in no particular order here, on the list that was mentioned as we did our little go around, we were talking about having the right tool for the right job. And I can completely agree with that. The thing with that, though, especially at the stage that you guys are at, is perhaps you don't know what the right tool is for that right job. But having that right tool for that job, once you figure it out, will save you just an immense amount of time. No matter what you're doing on a farm, and again, no matter what type of farm operation you're managing, whether it's a market garden, whether it's grain crops, whether it's livestock, whether it's an apiary, whatever you happen to be managing, there is almost always more than one way of doing any particular job. Now, being beginner farmers, such as you guys are, often I will see people on Hayes Farm doing something the hard way. What I will often do is if I see somebody doing something and not using perhaps the best tool for the job, and they're getting something done, don't get me wrong, but they're maybe not be doing it the most efficient way. What I will often do on farm is I will come by and I will suggest another way of doing something. And then you know, humans being humans, sometimes my suggestions are taken to heart, and sometimes they're like, oh, I'm happy with the way I'm doing it now. And so I'm just kind of giving you some forewarning and some advice here. I will generally leave you alone to make your own mistakes. I do this with my kids all the time, and I think it's a fantastic way to learn. And if I still see you struggling an hour or 2 hours later, I'll come back around and I'll show you another way of doing it. But I enjoy letting people, you know, kind of, I wouldn't say flounder, but you know, find out different ways to do a job. And then as the day goes on, switch some gears, switch some strategies. And then at the end of the day, you'll be able to look back and say, yeah, that's the way to do that particular job. Now, a prime example of this is weeding. So you guys, let's look at field block 1 for an example, just because it's so nice and straight and narrow and laid out. So, you know, 7 100-foot beds is what you're looking at. It is very easy to get carried away with weeding, say, 1 20-foot section of one of those 7 beds. And you could do just a magnificent, fantastic, just such a great job just getting in there on your hands and knees and doing those weeding and taking out those individual weeds, and you might do a pristine weeding job, and that 20 feet of that bed of, I don't know, let's say lettuce will look amazing. But it also took you all day to do it, and the rest of your 6.5 or 6 3/4 beds are all kind of going to shit in the meantime. So yes, you could spend a lot of time and do that 20 feet pristinely well, while the other 680 bed feet you have is going to weeds. Or you can pick up, say, a stirrup hoe and do it a much faster way. It might not be perhaps as thorough as getting down on your hands and knees, but you'll be able to manage in that same amount of time on that 20-foot bed, you'll be able to manage maybe close to 200 feet by using the right tool for the right job. Now, speaking of stirrup hose, how many of you guys are familiar with your hose?
I'm very familiar with my hose. There's the stirrup hoe, which I love, is great because it actually has movement to it, and it's got an open mouth. So basically, it looks like a horse's stirrup, and it gets at the root, and you can jostle a bit, so it gives you a little bit more force to take it out. A straight hoe or a flat hoe, you're usually getting into the earth kind of like a pickaxe, and you got to really give it. Stirrup hoe, it flows with you. It's awesome.
Jared, you know your hose. I'm glad you jumped in there. So stirrup hoe is one of my absolute favorite tool on the farm. I have a wheel hoe that hangs up in the barn. The wheel hoe is a stirrup hoe with a wheel attached to it. And Jared, I'm going to address this to you in particular. As you were saying about the traditional hoe I use more for moving earth, much like you're saying, much like that kind of pickaxe kind of action. So if you're out there with a traditional hoe, and hang on, let me get some pictures happening here too. If you're out there with a stirrup hoe, if you're out there with the traditional hoe, and you're trying to use it just to scrape the top of the soil in order to get rid of weeds, it's going to take you more time than it will to use the stirrup hoe. Stirrup hoe, like Jared was saying, has that little bit of flexibility. It kind of rocks back and forth, and you're using this here blade just barely under the soil just to kill all those weeds and get them done. It does such a great job so quickly. Yeah, it's a fantastic. As this says here, the Haas stirrup hoe makes weeding a breeze, and it really does. Another great tool in the hoe department, are you familiar with the collinear hoe there?
I am.
I love the collinear hoe, and we'll talk more about this in, if it loads up. We'll talk more about the collinear hoe on farm too. There is, you guys are collinear hoe. you guys are able to see my screen right now? Yes? Video's coming up for you. Collinear hoe is a different type of hoe with a very flat blade on it.
It's streaming quite choppy for me.
Womp womp. This is a video of Elliot Coleman, who is over in Maine, and he's just given a demonstration on how to use a collinear hoe. So as I was saying, like for this here space of ground that he just worked, literally in like 48 seconds here of this video, you could spend a significant amount of time on your hands and knees just picking out those individual little weeds, or you can run that collinear hoe across. Now, the reason I wanted to jump in on the hoe discussion is this afternoon and into tomorrow. Tomorrow we will be on farm all day tomorrow. When we were looking at that field operation calendar, there were some beds that needed to be prepped this week. Which I love to see you guys, get familiar with that with your field blocks this afternoon, and then maybe start to get into some of that bed prep tomorrow. Now, I wanted to kind of introduce these different hoes to you, and we do have the 3 hoes we've been talking about. We got the collinear hoe, the stirrup hoe, and a traditional hoe, and a wheel hoe too. So we got 4 hoes to choose from. But as you're pulling back the mulch to prep your bed areas, and some areas are going to be weedier in some field blocks than other field blocks, you're going to have a choice. You're going to have to decide on how to eliminate those weeds from that area you just pulled that mulch off of. You could go down there on your hands and knees and do an extremely thorough job if time allows. Or you could go and grab the right tool for the right job and attack it with a stirrup hoe, or a collinear hoe, or a traditional hoe. Now, excuse me. If this video was working for some of you, and you have the option of going and kind of watching these videos on your own time too at that, but the collinear hoe works extremely well. And let me see if I can find a picture of that. The collinear hoe works extremely well for dealing with weeds when they are just emerging. And that is your absolute best time to deal with weeds as they are just emerging. Whereas the stirrup hoe works best when you have weeds that are a little bit more mature and you're looking to take out even sometimes almost mature plants. The stirrup hoe will take those out really nicely. But the collinear hoe is a super lightweight hoe that will work very fast for seedlings that are just emerging. And that could be the case on many of the field block beds. Can you guys see this picture of the collinear hoe? So that's the collinear hoe versus the stirrup hoe versus a traditional hoe. Oh, look at this. We got a wheel hoe here too. Let's see if we can get a wheel hoe up here. So we only have one wheel hoe at the farm. If you choose to use the wheel hoe, you will have to sanitize it between uses. Our wheel hoe has just a single wheel on it. Seeing if we can get. This is exactly the wheel hoe we have. It was purchased at Lee Valley. It's called the Haas wheel hoe. Something else you might want to consider when you're prepping your beds is breaking out the wheel hoe and using this. Oh. And so here's the wheel hoe, and having the option of having the wheel on the front, and this here is where the stirrup hoe goes right behind the wheel. You're able to get in really close to plants and make a quick pass in no time. You can do a 100-foot bed in the time, as long as the weeds aren't too mature and too out of control. You can weed a 100-foot bed in roughly the time it takes you to kind of walk slowly down the bed. That's how quick a wheel hoe will work. Great tool. Okay. However, we have now reached our time where we got to kind of switch some gears. Like I was saying, I'm going to revisit this practical skills talk next Monday's class. We'll tack it on at the end of the day there a little bit. I do plan to address watering and irrigation needs. I find that is another practical skill, and all of you guys are going to need to be able to operate our irrigation system, which is currently not set up, but you'll get a tutorial on that. I also wanted to talk about pest management in there too as a practical farm skill. And then I also wanted to talk about fertility management as a practical farm skill. And we'll try to revisit those next Monday's